I'm behind the wheel of a Porsche 911, but this is the 996 model. And the 996 model of the 911 is perhaps the least liked, maybe even the most hated 911.
I'm behind the wheel of a 2005 Porsche 911, the 997 generation of 911. And this is perhaps the most loved generation of Porsche 911.
Tommy, these two cars are only 2 years apart, and yet a good 996 like this one is worth only about $20,000, and a 997 can be worth up to $70,000 or $80,000. Why is that?
Well, I think the first and obvious reason is people don't like the look, in general, of the 996. This is the first and the only 911 to have a non-circular headlight. Now, this launched in the late 90s with what they called the fried egg headlight. It looks like you broke an egg and the yolk settled at the bottom. This is the updated 996 with the more angular headlight, but I think people love and desire the look of the classic 911 front end.
But both these cars share an almost identical chassis. They have very similar engines, both have IMS issues, and yet there's like a $50,000 delta between these two cars. So let's find out why.
One of the big sticking points people have with 996s is the interior. Now, this car, it had an uphill battle to climb because it was the first car to replace the legendary lineage of the air-cooled 911. And those cars, from the 1960s to the 1990s, had a very similar interior layout and very high quality of materials. Now, of course, the 996 had to save money somewhere because Porsche was bleeding money at this era, so they did cheapen up the interior quite a lot. So the quality of plastics, materials, and the overall bubbly shape hasn't aged nearly as well as the air-cooled cars or nearly as well as some of the later cars as well. So when you start looking at stuff, you're going to find that the plastics don't feel very good. They're not very high quality. And worst of all, for the 911 people, pretty much the entire interior was shared with the Porsche Boxster, which was at this time viewed as kind of the hairdresser's car, right? So the reality is, as a 25 or 26-year-old car, if you're buying one of these, I think it's fine, right? You buy this car for the driving experience, not so you can fondle the dashboard. And then there were things that they improved over the years, and depending on the options, these interiors can actually be quite nice, like this stitched leather binnacle here, the leather seats with the Porsche crest in the headrest. So there are nice aspects, but it's also a 911 with carpet on the doors. And to some extent, that is going to hurt the value. Now, as we evolve into the 997, certain things are going to be familiar in here and certain things are going to be pretty different. Now, what's so important to realize is that even though the 997 is technically an all-new generation of Porsche 911, it is largely, if you look at the structure and a lot of the features, more of like a facelift evolution of the 996. And when you step inside of it, there are going to be things that are very familiar, like the overall seating position, but even like the door handle designs and then the little cubbies in the door. That's all going to look very familiar. But what Porsche has done is they've really just elevated the quality of materials and then also modernized a lot of the design. So this one's got this really nice stitched leather dash that looks really good. The 997 also could be available with the Sport Chrono. So you have this wonderful little chronographer here on the dashboard. Chronograph? Not chronographer. I think that's a job, right? I'm going with chronograph. But the other thing too is like the seats got a lot better. So these sport bucket seats feel good. Even the standard entry-level seats in the base Carrera were much better. The steering wheel looked better. The gauge cluster looked better. So they basically kind of took the 996 formula and interior and then elevated it slightly in every way. And they gave it slightly better cup holders. They're still pretty crap compared to us American standards, but they are a little bit better. The one thing I do want to point out, as nice as this interior is, and it is a lot better than 996, it still has carpet on the doors. So if you hate carpet on the doors, it's there.
Now, Tommy, these two cars are not identical. That is a Carrera S in manual. This is an automatic Carrera. But I think what happened by the 997 generation is that people forgave Porsche from going from the air-cooled to the water-cooled, and they were used to it. So even though the interior is better in the 997, in terms of ride and handling, they're very similar, and we can show that by going on the road. Tom, you have to say I'm a huge fan of the 996. I always love bargains, and this is definitely the 911 bargain. At least it used to be, because people are starting to discover that these things drive and perform like any 911.
Yeah, I mean, the problem was the turbos exploded a couple years ago. Those were like $35,000 cars, and now they're double that easily, right? So that's really dragging the price up of even the base cars. Now, this 911 has the 5-speed Tiptronic automatic. Does this transmission ruin the driving experience? Because it certainly hurts the value of this car.
Well, this car also has the optional buttons on the steering wheel, so you can shift it yourself. And I have to say, Tommy, I understand people love dual clutches, but I'm a fan of the torque converter. You know, it downshifts really quickly. No. And look at that sound, man. It performs like any 911. Yeah, it probably doesn't have that razor sharp engagement that the 997 has with the manual, but if you want a cruiser and if you want something that's great in traffic, there's nothing better than a torque converter.
Yeah, so I mean, it's all about use case, right? Like, if you're not planning on actually using this car in the mountains like so many 911 buyers don't, right? Around town, I think that the tip car is actually completely fine, and it's not as bad as a lot of slush boxes from the early 2000s, especially the American stuff that was still 4 and sometimes 5-speed. This is a much more crisp transmission, and it actually works okay. But what's great about that is, even with the transmission somewhat hindering the performance attributes, this is still a really great car to drive. So 3.6 liter flat six, 320 horsepower in this car, and it still has the iconic engine character of a 911, where it makes all of its power right at redline.
So I grew up with manual transmissions, and I've always loved manuals, but there are times when a manual is just a pain in the ass, specifically in traffic, or when you're tired and you just want to go for a ride and you don't necessarily want to be shifting gears yourself. And I know I'm saying that because people today are worshiping at the altar of manuals because you can't get them. But, you know, when I was growing up, manuals were actually cheaper than automatics, and they were kind of easy to get. So I appreciate a good automatic, and this is a good automatic.
Well, let's talk about the rest of the driving experience. So steering, hydraulic assisted power steering in the 996, slightly lighter than the 997, but we're only talking like 100 or most 150 pound delta depending on trims. This is an excellent car to drive. Now, at the limit, it's a pretty narrow front tire, so you will experience a little bit of understeer, but it is such a great feeling operating the steering wheel. So you get a lot of feedback at pretty much every position, even right off center. The steering is excellent. It gives you a lot of communication on what's happening with the road. It's just awesome.
Yeah, and if you like a flat six, Tommy, and if you love pushing a car instead of pulling it, then this is the car to get. I mean, there is something iconic about a 911, and yes, so it has fried egg headlights, and yes, so the interior may not be up to the rest of the breed, but it's still a 911, and it still has all the attributes that have been so lovable and so great to drive over the last, 50 years now?
Yeah, for sure. And look, these cars are still very available. You mentioned that, you know, they are increasing in value, and they are, but you can still get cabs for in the $20,000 range. You can still get tips for the $20,000 range. A manual coupe is probably going to be in the 30s for a good one. It's still a tremendous amount of car for $30,000. And 320 horsepower at elevation like we live, it's not the quickest thing in the world, but at sea level, this is still a 5.5 second car, 0 to 60, and it lets you really experience that wonderful, soulful engine note. You know, more time than you might with a conventional modern car, because it's a little bit slower, so that experience is extended for more time.
Yeah, it's also the right size. You know, we had the current C4 Targa S, and that car is a big car, Tommy.
Yeah.
This is you know, this is the Goldilocks of the 911 range. It's big enough for somebody who's 6'2" to sit comfortably and enjoy the ride, and yet it's small enough to be nimble and to be quick-witted and to be fun in the mountains.
Well, it's also modern enough to still be reliable, right? So you still have a very modern engine management system. It's all OBD. You know, these cars are known for being very long-lasting, except for the IMS if that fails. But you see a lot of these cars with well over 100,000 miles, and everything just tends to keep working, right? All the modules, the airbag systems, they all seem pretty good. So if you want a fairly reliable modern classic, this is a good choice.
Yeah, hold on. Okay, I'm gonna stop you there because we bought that. Well, we'll talk about the 996 when we bought it, but when these things break, you are paying Porsche prices to fix them.
That's a great point. So even though it's cheap to get into, repairs are still pretty expensive.
Yeah, there's that rule, like you should, maybe retain like 10% of the purchase price for repairs. With a Porsche, I'd go 25%, especially with a cheaper 911, because you are going to have to pay for a Porsche technician to put in Porsche parts if you value that, which I think most people do, and that's going to get expensive quickly.
So one of the unfortunate things about the 996, and the thing you're going to read about most online, is something called the IMS failure. It stands for intermediate shaft, and it's a bearing kind of at the heart of the powertrain that fails in these cars, and when it fails, it can take out the entire engine. Now, there's vast speculation online about how prevalent IMS failure is. Some say 10%, some say 1%, but the truth is probably somewhere in between those two. 3 or 4% is a typical region I hear, and a lot of folks think that when they buy a 996, the first thing they have to do is replace the IMS as a precaution. The good news is these cars are old enough where the IMS has either failed or likely been replaced with a better unit. So it's a good shot that if you're buying a 996, it's always good to check, but there's a good chance that that bearing has been replaced. Now, as low as the failure percentages likely are, this car, this exact 996, had an IMS failure a few years back, and it did cost the previous owner $20,000 for a new engine. So I think that the issue as a whole is probably overblown, but there is always that nagging thing in the back of your head that, if it fails, and it can fail at random, I'm going to need a new engine.
Hold on, Timmy, I got to correct you. So yes, the IMS failed, and this engine has only about 40,000 miles on it, while the car has much more than that.
Yep.
But Porsche paid to replace the engine, so the owner actually wasn't out of pocket 20K, it was Porsche who paid.
But that was a bunch of years ago. I'm not so sure if it fails now that they're going to cover it.
But that also leaves a question of bore scoring. Let's talk about that. Now, these 997 Carrera S's had a different issue, and it's the dreaded bore scoring. Basically, the inside of the piston becomes scored, and then you get combustion that bypasses the piston, the car starts smoking, and it's a complete engine rebuild. The problem, or the good thing about bore scoring, is that it can be diagnosed by using a scope, or you can do a compression test. Now, when we bought this car, we saw a compression test. The car already has over 104,000 miles on it. So at this point, if there had been bore scoring, it probably would have been found and recognized. I think this car is good. And once again, I think people overestimate just how much bore scoring there is, because it is one of those things, just like the IMS failure, that terrifies potential Porsche owners, because, like I said, you're looking at a complete engine rebuild if you do suffer from that particular Porsche ailment.
I mean, the best way to solve bore scoring is to buy like an 09, 2010 and later.
Yeah, so you buy the DOT 2.
Yeah, because they officially sorted it out then. These early cars, it is a little bit of a gamble.
Yeah, you're also going to pay a much higher premium for that DOT 2.
Yeah.
And you'll also get a little bit nicer interior. But if you're on a budget, then this is a good way to go. Tommy, this isn't exactly apples to apples, because this 997 is a manual and it is a Carrera S, but they do share a lot in common with the 996. Same chassis, same basic shape, and outside of the headlights, they're very similar in their basic architecture.
I mean, I think a lot of people would disagree with that, the hardcore Porsche people, but you do park them side by side, and certainly the unibody and the body in white is very similar between the two. But this is the Carrera S, right? And the Carrera S, as we know it today, was introduced in the 997 generation. In the 996, there was the C4S, but really this is kind of the genesis of the modern Carrera S. Rear-wheel drive, Porsche active suspension management. PASM was introduced in this generation, right? It's got a little bit more power than the standard 911. I think this one's 355.
Yep.
And let's see how the performance is. Are you ready?
Yep.
I mean, in the real world, this car is significantly faster than a 997, at least the base car.
Yeah, the 996 will certainly keep up and exceed traffic. this will blow past it.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, this is, even by modern standards, you know, we've owned a bunch of these kind of like luxury sports cars from 20 years ago. Most of them feel pretty tame by modern standards, but this is a case where even 21 years later, this is still a properly quick car. But I think the big difference in the driving dynamics is the responsiveness, right? This is such a crisper car in pretty much every input. So while the 996 had communicative steering, this car has fast communicative steering. While the 996 had a responsive engine, this is a deliberately responsive engine. At any point in any part of the RPM, you hit the throttle and you feel that response.
Yeah, and this car has over 100,000 miles and it's still sharp as a tack.
It is, yeah, it's held up amazingly well. And I think that is one thing that's nice about this 997 is like even the interiors seem to hold up pretty well. I mean, there are aspects that are looking a little bit dated, but for the most part, all the buttons work, all the features in here work. This could be a fairly modern car. You wouldn't expect it to have over 100K.
Yeah, especially with this aftermarket head unit I put in. So now it has Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and it does everything that a modern car would. So if you're listening to your podcast on your run, it'll all automatically transfer to the car, which is pretty damn cool.
Now with PASM, Porsche Active Suspension Management, we can really dial in our suspension, and it has an enormous difference when you go from the normal to the sport mode, right? There's also a sport mode button here for the suspension. We also have much more modern traction control and stability control and that kind of thing that we were lacking in the 996. And then if you get the updated version data of this car, the 997.2, which came out in late 2008, well, that car then introduced PDK, dual clutch technology, right? Direct fuel injection. So I think what people really love about this car is it's got some classic, iconic, small, nimble 911 driving experience that you're missing from the new one, but with modern fuel injection and even more modern features on the inside compared to the 996.
Yeah, so a lot of people actually prefer the non-direct injected cars because they say they sound better.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I do think that this is a fantastic sounding car. It's a little bit quiet out of the box. You can still hear that howl though.
But you can fix that with an aftermarket.
Oh, really easily, yeah. But this is, it's interesting. I know that, like we were saying, fundamentally they're the same cars. This is a much more aggressive, fun driving experience. I think part of it's down to the transmission, but also part of it is just down to how much tighter this one feels.
Yeah, and the other great thing about this, Tommy, is today everybody, of course, is longing for the GT3 or the GT3 RS. And back when this was introduced, I think people of my generation didn't actually, well, I could say appreciate, I would say want, race cars for the road. So this is about as sharp of a road car as you can get without actually having to make the sacrifice of having a race car for the road and all that entails, right? So today, if you want a manual 911, you can get yourself a 911T, which is over $150,000, or you got to go to a GT product. And the problem I have with GT products is they sacrifice livability, drivability for performance, and I want a car that I'm comfortable in, and yet at the same time is sharp on the road. I don't need necessarily a track car because I'm not taking this to the track, and I think we've lost that in today's modern 911.
I agree. So the question is, you know, I think we're both agreeing that this car does drive noticeably better than the old one, but is it really worth 2, 3, maybe even 4 times as much as the old one?
I don't think it matters what we think because the market certainly values it that. But having said that, Tommy, if you want a 911 experience and you don't have $80,000 sitting in your pocket plus another, let's call it 25% to fix it, then the 996 is one hell of a bargain. And I think the market is also starting to appreciate that because the prices of 996s are going up because it is the last affordable 911. And while this one, the 997.1, is relatively affordable, for $70,000 or $80,000, you can get yourself a brand new Corvette.
Yeah, and I mean, that's going to be quite a bit more performance and a warranty compared to a 20-year-old Porsche.
Yeah, and it's going to be mid-engine, which, you know, a lot of people will say is ideal for the track. So Tommy, if you're looking for a modern 911 that isn't air-cooled, I still think that this is the sweet spot in the range. The 996, even though it is much feared and much hated because of the headlights and because of the interior, it still is fundamentally a 911 and drives and performs like a 911. And I think if you can get one in manual and one that's a coupe as opposed to a convertible, then you've got yourself a pretty sweet ride.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what we're looking at here, the reason that one is loved and one isn't loved is because one was a fundamental mind shift change in what a 911 is. It was the first of its breed, right? And I think that caught a lot of people off guard. And the reason the 997 is loved is it's kind of the last of its breed, right? It was the last 911 to offer a turbo with a manual transmission, the last 911 with hydraulic power steering, right? And these are things that people really are looking for. So this was kind of looked as perfection, where that was looked as kind of, you know, the start of it, where they hadn't quite figured things out. But as a whole, from a driving experience standpoint, especially value, I think that the 996 is the way to go.
Yeah, and if you're looking at a new 911, it's also going to be much bigger, so people love kind of the compactness of this size. It is very sporty because it's very small, and it's also, in terms of affordability, relatively affordable. I remember when a 911, like 5 years ago, started at just under $100,000. You want to get yourself a 911T today, Tommy, you're looking at over $150,000.
Yeah, that's crazy. Well, guys, let us know what you think in the comment section below. Would you save some money and get the 996 or upgrade to the 997? We'd love to hear your feedback.
As always, this is Roman.
And Tommy, head on over to alltfl.com and we'll have more videos for you coming soon.
Ciao.